7 years after the events, the official explanation for the collapse of Building 7 was finally released.
New York City, 2001. No tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to fire. But that's exactly what investigators believe happened to the 47-story World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11th. According to a 3-year comprehensive building and fire safety investigation just completed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires. We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse. And in fact, we've shown for the first time that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
The NIST computer model was validated with evidence from videos, photos, witness accounts, and other data.
So you look at the floors failing here, and eventually this column 79 is going to buckle. It fails, and then the entire vertical progression takes place.
A chain reaction then caused other interior columns to fail in quick succession. The outside shell of the building fell.
This computer model seems to represent something very different from what happened in real life to Building 7. As seen here, both top sides of the building bend inwards as the collapse begins. In reality, however, both sides of Building 7 followed a perfect vertical line from top to bottom. Let's see them again, side by side. With such a visible discrepancy between the model and the real event, one is left to wonder on the actual reliability of the NIST report altogether. This introduces a second problem.
In order for the perimeter to fall perfectly and symmetrically, which it pretty much does at Building 7, all of those columns have to be removed within a tenth of a second of each other.
This is the time to do away with the idea circulated by some people that Building 7 was somehow weaker than normal buildings, as it had been built over an existing General Electric substation. First of all, every office building in the United States gets approved only if it's designed with a certain redundancy over its structural limits, no matter where or how it's built. Secondly, it had been Larry Silverstein in person to reinforce the structure at the time of the purchase of the building by his company, Salomon Brothers. This 1989 article by the New York Times stated that Salomon Brothers, Silverstein's company, was to spend nearly 2 years and more than $200 million cutting out floors, adding elevators, reinforcing steel girders, upgrading power supplies and making other improvements to the building they had just bought. We built in enough redundancy to allow entire portions of floors to be removed without affecting the building's structural integrity, said Larry Silverstein, president of the company. More than 375 tons of steel, requiring 12 miles of welding, will be installed to reinforce floors for Salomon's extra equipment. If anything, Building 7 was stronger than it needed to be, not weaker. Question: can you explain how the failure of one column can bring about the symmetrical collapse of the entire building, which requires the failure of all the columns within fractions of a second from each other? Even if we were to accept the NIST explanation for the collapse, everyone agrees that it would remain a unique event in the history of modern architecture.
This is the first and only skyscraper in the world to have collapsed because of fire.
No steel frame high-rise building has ever collapsed due to fire.
Until this occurrence, no building had fallen down because of fire.
In over 20 years, I have not seen a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
No building built out of structural steel has ever collapsed before or since 9/11 due to structural fire.
The uniqueness of the event is confirmed by Mr. Sunder himself.
Our high-rise buildings in this country are very, very safe. Having a collapse of this nature is a very rare event.
If this is true, however, how could so many people have had pre-knowledge of the collapse, even in the early hours of the afternoon?
All I can attest to is that by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
Around 3 p.m., the owner of WTC 7, in his own words, authorized the building's demolition.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Later on, Silverstein explained that he meant to pull the firemen's contingent, not the building itself. Not only is this explanation linguistically difficult to accept,
and you don't say, we made the decision to pull it, which refers to something. You wouldn't say that about a group of firemen. You would say, we made a decision to pull them out of the building.
But we know for a fact that there had been no fireman operation in Building 7, as confirmed by the NIST preliminary report. In any case, it is clear that the impending collapse had been announced to the police and firemen well in advance.
They said, hey, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about taking this building down.
Fireman Holowak, we were just hanging out until Tower 7 came down. Fireman Sweeney, we stood and waited for 7 World Trade Center to come down. The rumor must have been circulating for a while, as it reached CNN by 4:15 in the afternoon.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7, in the World Trade Center complex is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
This also explains why the BBC's correspondent from New York, who was unfamiliar with the local landscape, announced that the collapse had already taken place by 5 p.m., when in fact the building was still standing right behind her. This incident has fueled ridiculous theories in which the worldwide media would have received pre-scripted information, while it is quite obvious that it was only the consequence of the warning circulating for many hours, and eventually being picked up by CNN.
Schools that are being turned into triage centers.
Question: if the failure of a steel structure due to fire was unprecedented, how could so many people predict it hours in advance? Finally, this clip aired by CNN confirms the widespread foreknowledge of the collapse in the area just before it happened.
Keep your eye on that building as it's coming down.
Building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Question: why would police and firefighters use words such as blow up, bring down, if only a structural collapse was expected? Bonus question: why do you think that all the previous questions have never found an honest answer for the last 8 years? We conclude with a message from the first responders, who are dying by the dozens after having inhaled the poisonous air from Ground Zero, in the complete silence of the media.
And every time Popular Mechanics calls the people of this movement nuts, and every time Time magazine dismisses real, hard physical evidence that a new investigation needs to be launched into how concrete was pulverized, every time Time magazine dismisses that evidence and instead writes a 2-page article about the psychology of the conspiracy movement, these propagandists, professional liars and tools who cannot, even by any stretch of the imagination, be considered journalists, strike another nail into the coffin of another rescue worker. We who are still dying from 9/11, who went into the towers and into that pile, now live with those buildings in our lungs and digestive systems and our blood. And if you allow these scumbags to strip you and this movement of our legitimacy, you condemn first responders to death.
This is an orange. If you were told it was something else, you wouldn't believe it, would you? This is called visual identification based on experience. This building is about to be destroyed in what is called a controlled demolition. Buildings do not do this spontaneously. Here is another example of a controlled demolition. The initial charges are spaced about 1 second apart. and you can see that each section begins falling separately. Successful demolitions require that all structural support columns collapse at virtually the same time. If they don't, or if something else goes wrong, the result will look something like this. This is World Trade Center 7 just before it collapsed on September the 11th, 2001. It had not been hit by an aircraft. It had been damaged by falling debris and fire. But by 5:20 p.m. most of the fires had been extinguished. Although the building was 47 stories high, it doesn't fall sideways, nor collapse unevenly. For this to have happened, all of the building's vertical supports must have given way at almost exactly the same time. Yet the Federal Emergency Management Agency reported that the collapse was due primarily to fire. But what does it look like to you? As at July 2007, there is no final report on the collapse of World Trade Center 7. But the National Institute of Standards and Technology still rules out a controlled demolition. So the question is, do you believe what you can see with your own eyes, or do you believe what you are told?
Middle of the road. All of a sudden, there was a roll, an explosion, and we could see coming at us a ball of flame stories high.
Looking like a Three Stooges movie covered in plastic, I swear to God. What do you got a good shit with that? That's good shit. Then we went back there. Whoa, 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 whoa!
Difficulties around the area. New Jersey Transit outbound Hoboken terminal operating on a load-and-go basis, no inbound service, and also out of Newark station, limited service on the northeast corner and North Jersey coastlines. We expect to hear from President Bush. Difficulties around the area. New Jersey Transit outbound Hoboken terminal operating on a load-and-go basis, no inbound service. We expect to hear from President Bush. Difficulties around the area. New Jersey Transit outbound Hoboken terminal operating on a load-and-go basis, no inbound service.
bent right into its footprint. So